She was once Hollywood's hottest rising star, but ended up buried in an unmarked grave. Barbara Payton's life was a whirlwind of fame, scandal, and collapse, all before age 40. So, how does a woman go from red carpets to bounced checks and bar fights? This is the story Hollywood wants you to forget. Small-town beginnings and a fast exit. Barbara Payton was born in Cloquet, Minnesota. Her birth year was 1927. Her father, Lee, worked for a paper mill, and her mother, Mabel, ran the household. Not long after Barbara's birth, the family left Minnesota and moved to Odessa, Texas. By the time she was a teenager, World War II was underway. Like a lot of young people in wartime America, Barbara moved fast. At just 16 years old, she married her high school boyfriend, William Hodge. It was 1943, and to some, that kind of marriage made sense. The war made everything feel temporary. You didn't wait. You grabbed what you could, and you didn't ask too many questions. But Barbara didn't get married out of fear or sentiment. She got married because she wanted a way out. Marriage seemed like freedom. It offered the promise of independence and movement. She didn't want to be stuck in Odessa, and Hodge was a way to leave. But Barbara didn't do well with routine. Domestic life didn't excite her. Cooking dinner, folding laundry, keeping house, none of it made sense to someone who wanted to be seen, known, and remembered. Within a few years, the marriage was falling apart. Rumors spread that Barbara had been involved with other men. People whispered about her behavior in town. The gossip started early in her life, and it never really stopped. By the end of the 1940s, her relationship with Hodge was over. The marriage hadn't given her what she wanted, and it hadn't brought her any closer to her real goal. She wanted out of Texas completely. But before she left, she tried again with someone else. In 1945, she married John Payton. He was steadier than Hodge, less dramatic, and more grounded. For a short time, Barbara settled into something that looked like a normal life. In 1947, she gave birth to a son, John Jr. For a while, she played the part of a stay-at-home wife and mother. She cooked meals, raised her baby, and lived in a modest home. People around her probably thought she had finally calmed down, but Barbara wasn't built for calm. There was still that drive inside her, the belief that something bigger was waiting if she could just break through. She started modeling, sending out her photo, and knocking on doors. She wasn't afraid to ask for work. She posed for catalogs, small ads, and anything that paid and got her noticed. She began traveling more. She dressed flashier. Her friends noticed a change. She was still in Texas on paper, but her mind was already somewhere else. Her marriage to John Payton didn't last. By 1950, she had separated from him. Some said she left quietly. Others said she walked out without looking back. Either way, she was gone. She left her son with his father and packed her things for California. She didn't have much, but she had enough to get started. She arrived in Los Angeles just as the studio system was still in full swing. Beautiful women from all over the country were arriving every week, hoping to be discovered. Most of them went home disappointed. Barbara didn't plan on being one of them. She didn't come to Hollywood for small parts or background work. She came for the top. She had no agent, no resume, no support system, but she had ambition, and she had a look that got attention fast. Her blonde hair, strong features, and sharp attitude set her apart. People in casting rooms remembered her, even if they didn't hire her right away. She knew how to sell herself. She had practiced it for years without realizing it. She started spending time at parties, meeting producers, and listening for any lead that might get her in front of a camera. She moved through the early Hollywood scene like someone who had already decided she belonged there. She hadn't booked any real roles yet, but even then, she acted like someone with a future. The studios hadn't put her name in lights, but she acted like they eventually would. First roles and fast recognition. It didn't take long before producers and photographers started paying attention. She had something they couldn't manufacture: presence. She wasn't polished in the way most studio girls were trained to be. She didn't follow the usual formula. That unpredictability gave her an on-screen tension that audiences responded to. Her early work wasn't in prestige pictures, but it got her through the door. In 1949, she landed a role in a crime film called Trapped. It wasn't a blockbuster, but it was gritty, sharp, and visually striking. She played a seductive woman, tangled up in a world of counterfeit money and double-crossing. It was a classic noir setup, and Barbara fit right in. Critics noted her energy, even if the reviews weren't glowing. She wasn't polished, but she didn't need to be. She stood out. Trapped gave her enough credibility to keep her moving. She wasn't stuck in the endless cycle of screen tests and walk-on roles anymore. By 1951, she was starring in Bride of the Gorilla, a horror movie that didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was, a low-budget jungle drama with supernatural overtones. Barbara played the lead female role, a plantation owner's widow drawn into a bizarre curse involving a gorilla spirit and a jealous lover. It was campy and strange, but again, she was hard to ignore. She delivered her lines with conviction, even when the plot veered off the rails. Directors liked her boldness. She didn't ask for permission before delivering a scene her way. She didn't need to be coached into intensity or pushed into drama. She brought it naturally. One director reportedly said that she was the only actress on set who didn't fake a reaction. She gave you something real, whether the script called for it or not. Another said she had what they called live wire appeal. You could never predict exactly what she was going to do in a take, but you couldn't take your eyes off her once she started. She also had good timing. The early 1950s were full of actresses trying to follow the studio playbook, but Barbara didn't look like she was trying to play any role but her own. She had that rare quality that made casting directors willing to take a risk. That's why even though she wasn't a household name yet, people within the industry thought she might become one. She had the raw material. With the right script, the right co-star, and a little luck, she could have become one of the decade's biggest breakout names. For a while, that looked like a real possibility. She had the kind of look that sold movie tickets and the kind of performance that kept people watching once they were seated. Her films didn't always win awards, but they got her noticed. She didn't need $1 million budget to shine. She could do it in a jungle set with a guy in a gorilla suit if that's what the role called for, and that's exactly what she did. Between 1949 and 1951, Barbara moved quickly from face in the crowd to lead actress. She was working steadily. Studios saw her as bankable enough to headline their lower-tier releases. Cinematographers liked filming her. Her face was photographed beautifully under harsh lighting. She knew how to hit her angles and adjust her expressions depending on what emotion the director wanted. She had control over her performance, but it didn't look rehearsed. That balance made her valuable. During interviews, she didn't stick to scripted answers. She wasn't afraid to tell a reporter if she thought a role was boring or a co-star was difficult. That honesty made her likable to some and off-putting to others, but it was part of her image. She didn't pretend to be a sweetheart. She didn't package herself as a studio-made sweetheart or polished product. She was just Barbara. That unfiltered personality created a buzz. Some of it was good, some of it was cautious, but it always kept her name circulating. She wasn't boxed into one type of role. She could play sultry, smart, suspicious, or just straight-up mean, depending on what the script demanded. That range made her usable across genres. Whether it was noir, crime, horror, or melodrama, Barbara could find a way to fit. The parts weren't always high-profile, but they built her resume and expanded her reach. In a time when women were often cast for one specific trait, she managed to show several. By the end of 1951, she had real momentum. Producers were looking at her for more roles. Publicists were building her image as a bold and modern woman. Her name started showing up more frequently in press releases, film columns, and behind-the-scenes chatter. But while the scripts kept coming, other parts of her life were starting to drift. Her off-screen decisions began making their way into quiet conversations behind studio doors. Some people started asking questions about what she was doing when she wasn't on set, and those questions would soon grow louder. Growing notoriety and studio warnings. Columnists were quick to link her to major male stars. Her name was casually dropped next to James Cagney's after she appeared in Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye. Nobody confirmed anything, but the press didn't need confirmation. In Hollywood, even a dinner meeting or a shared car ride could be spun into a headline. For Barbara, these stories were a double-edged sword. They gave her publicity, which helped her stay in the conversation. But they also sent a signal to studios. She was already becoming a handful. She wasn't shy about speaking her mind. She answered questions directly, often with biting honesty, and didn't sugarcoat anything. That made her refreshing in a town full of polished personas, but it also made executives nervous. She couldn't be molded into a quiet, obedient studio starlet. Barbara had her own rhythm, and she wasn't going to let anyone else control it. The more she showed up in gossip columns, the more casting directors hesitated. She might be striking and photogenic, but her growing reputation made her a risk. She became known as someone who would walk off set if she was bored, or challenge a director's authority if she disagreed with a scene. For smaller studios, that unpredictability might be manageable. For the big ones, it was a red flag. Behind closed doors, executives started having quiet conversations about her. She was being flagged, not for lack of talent, but for being too visible in the wrong places. She wasn't on the front page of Variety for breakout performances. She was on the back pages of fan magazines for her nightlife, relationships, and the growing list of controversies around her name. Producers had already seen how fast a personal scandal could overshadow a rising career. They weren't willing to stake a major project on someone whose name was associated more with off-screen drama than box office success. Even directors who had praised her earlier started backing away. They didn't want their productions to turn into circus acts. They needed predictability, and Barbara was anything but that. At auditions, her reputation walked in before she did. Her name came with a history, even though her actual film resume was still short. She had the looks, the presence, and the talent, but by this point, some casting agents were instructed to pass even before she read a line. They didn't want someone whose story might change the focus of a film's release. The press would write more about Barbara Payton's latest romance than about the movie itself. She still got offers, but they were different now. Instead of being groomed for major studio leads, she was being handed roles in lower-budget thrillers or campy B-films. These were the parts that didn't require stability or studio endorsement. They only needed a face the audience would recognize and enough buzz to fill cheap theater seats. Barbara fit that need, but not the one she originally chased: top billing, respect, and a permanent place in the A-list crowd. Barbara noticed the shift. She saw which roles she was being offered and which ones suddenly disappeared. The enthusiasm that had greeted her just a year or two earlier was cooling off. The red carpets weren't as frequent. The meetings weren't as warm. She had become a name that meant more trouble than promise. What made it harder was that Barbara didn't try to fake stability. She didn't apologize or try to clean up her image. She leaned into her reputation, which only made her more unpredictable in the eyes of Hollywood's gatekeepers. Some saw that as strength, but the people holding the contract saw it as unreliability. And in a business that depends on timing, image, and smooth promotion, that's enough to get you quietly pushed to the side. She was still recognized in public. Fans still followed her in magazines. But her name was slipping further from casting calls and screen tests. The kinds of producers who once offered her generous contracts were moving on to other girls, ones with fewer headlines, cleaner reputations, and more manageable personalities. Barbara was only in her mid-20s, but her window at the top was already closing. That didn't stop the columnists from writing about her. In fact, the fewer roles she got, the more stories came out about where she was, who she was seen with, and what went wrong. Her image wasn't fading, it was shifting. She was no longer a promising newcomer. She was a cautionary tale in progress. Studios read the same papers everyone else did. They didn't want to hire someone who'd be in a tabloid spread before the movie even premiered. For Barbara, those headlines had once been a shortcut to fame. Now, they were the thing keeping her out of work. But just as Hollywood began distancing itself from her, two men stepped into her life, turning a fragile career into a national scandal. A public love triangle turns violent. The first was Franchot Tone, a well-respected actor known for his smooth charm and upper-class air. He had been nominated for an Oscar, starred in films alongside Hollywood royalty, and had once been married to Joan Crawford. Tone had a reputation for being polished, thoughtful, and cultured, exactly the type of man studios like to align with. His connection to Barbara seemed surprising to some, but it was real. They were photographed together, they attended events as a couple, and he appeared genuinely smitten with her. The second man was Tom Neal. He wasn't a household name, but he had built a steady career in B-movies and had a reputation for being rough around the edges. He was a former boxer who had taken up acting, and he brought that same intensity into his personal life. Neal had a moody, unpredictable streak, and people around him knew he didn't always think before reacting. While Tone presented stability and prestige, Neil brought chaos and heat. Barbara moved between the two, never publicly committing to either. She was seen with both men in the same week, sometimes even on the same day. This wasn't speculation, it was reported and photographed. People inside the industry were whispering about what was going on, and the public was watching closely. It wasn't unusual for actresses to have high-profile relationships, but this triangle was different. This one had a fuse, and it was getting shorter by the day. And then, everything exploded on September 13, 1951. That night, Tom Neal showed up outside Barbara's West Hollywood apartment. Franchot Tone was already there. What exactly was said between the three of them is unclear. Some claimed Barbara tried to keep them apart. Others said she just stood by. What's certain is that Tom Neal launched into a physical attack that left Franchot unconscious. Tone suffered multiple injuries, including a broken cheekbone, a fractured nose, and a serious concussion. He fell into a brief coma and had to be hospitalized immediately. The attack wasn't quick and it wasn't minor. This wasn't a scuffle or a drunken fistfight. Neal reportedly beat Tone with his fists until he was unrecognizable. Neighbors heard the noise, police were called, paramedics arrived and took Tone to the hospital, where doctors worked to stabilize him. It was one of the most violent and publicized altercations involving Hollywood figures at the time. Photographs of Tone's bruised and swollen face ran in newspapers across the country. Columnists latched onto the story with full force. Barbara's name was in every headline, even though she hadn't thrown a single punch. Reporters painted her as the cause of the fight, the reason these two men had destroyed each other. Some headlines called her a femme fatale. Others accused her of manipulating both men. There wasn't much sympathy. The public tone was more fascination than concern. What made this incident even more shocking was how rare this kind of open violence was among high-profile actors. Hollywood usually kept its messes behind studio walls. Public image was everything. Scandals were either cleaned up quietly or buried under new press. But this one was too loud, too bloody, and too public to hide. Barbara didn't make any formal statements right away. She didn't hold a press conference or deny anything. Instead, she was seen going about her days as if nothing had happened. Paparazzi caught her shopping, visiting restaurants, and heading back into her apartment. To some, this came across as cold. To others, it looked like damage control without any real plan. Tom Neal, on the other hand, didn't escape legal scrutiny. While no criminal charges were ultimately filed, reportedly because Tone didn't cooperate, his reputation took a serious hit. Even B-movie producers became hesitant to work with him. That fight would stay attached to his name for years. Barbara was now carrying a public reputation she couldn't easily shake off. She wasn't just known as an actress or a model. She was the woman at the center of a scandal that sent one man to the hospital and nearly destroyed another's career. People looked at her differently. It wasn't about talent anymore. It was about danger, unpredictability, and headlines. And just when everyone thought she'd go into hiding or issue a quiet apology, she did something that made the whole situation even more confusing. A sudden marriage followed by collapse. 2 weeks after Franchot Tone was beaten unconscious outside Barbara Payton's apartment, she married him. His face was still swollen. He had just come out of the hospital, and yet, on September 28, 1951, Barbara stood beside him in front of a justice of the peace and became his wife. There was no Hollywood chapel, no grand guest list, no studio-issued photo spread. Just two people in a hurried ceremony with more questions than answers. Barbara wore a white dress and a smile for the cameras, but there wasn't much joy behind it either. The wedding felt more like a reaction than a decision. Just days earlier, the world had watched in disbelief as Tom Neal, her other romantic interest, physically attacked Tone in broad daylight. Tone's injuries were serious enough to put him in a coma. Reporters followed every update like it was a soap opera, and Barbara was now at the center of it. People expected her to pick a side. Instead, she confused everyone. She stood by the man who had nearly died. Some saw it as loyalty. Others thought it was guilt. Maybe it was something else entirely. Maybe Barbara believed marriage would fix things. Not just with Tone, but with her image, her career, and her place in a town where public mistakes were currency. The press had a field day. The headlines were a mix of pity and ridicule. Photos of Tone's bruised face were placed side by side with the wedding announcement. Nobody could make sense of it. Studio heads watched closely. Up until this point, Barbara had been controversial but controllable. She was unpredictable but marketable. This marriage changed that. It wasn't just a scandal anymore, it was chaos, and Hollywood didn't like chaos unless they could script it. Inside the marriage, things broke down quickly. Franco Tone tried to act as if it was a fresh start. He returned to work, still healing, and tried to keep Barbara out of the tabloids, but her attention was already drifting. Within weeks, she was back in touch with Tom Neal. People in their circle started seeing them together again, first quietly, then openly. Some said she never stopped seeing him. Others claimed Tone never really had her to begin with. The tension that led to the first fight between the two men never disappeared. Barbara played both sides for a while, but it didn't last. She left Tone less than 2 months after the wedding. The marriage officially lasted just 53 days. By February of the next year, their divorce was finalized. There were no joint statements, no reconciliations, and no studio cleanup job to protect the story. The industry had already made up its mind. Studios didn't send letters. Producers didn't call. People she once considered friends stopped answering. Barbara had crossed an invisible line. In a town that ran on image and control, she had become unpredictable in ways no one wanted to be associated with. It didn't matter that she had a real screen presence or that directors once praised her raw energy. The risk was too high now. The blacklist wasn't official. There was no paper trail, no formal decision made in an office, but it was real. Barbara Payton, once seen as a breakout star, couldn't get a serious role. No major studio would take a chance. Casting directors passed without comment. Her phone stopped ringing. Her name became shorthand for drama. It didn't take long before she realized how quickly things had shifted. She kept going to events for a while, hoping to stay visible. Paparazzi still took her picture, but not because she had a new film. The headlines were about her personal life. People didn't talk about her talent anymore. They talked about the triangle, the wedding, the bruises, and the betrayal. Barbara had been known, then watched, and now she was being avoided. Franco Tone didn't publicly comment on the end of the marriage. He went back to his career, slowly rebuilding what the scandal had interrupted. Tom Neal stayed close to Barbara for a while longer, but by the time she returned to him, his own career was already fading. They made a few public appearances and posed for some photos, but there was no comeback in the works. With her career frozen and her reputation burned, she entered a phase where visibility no longer helped her. And in a town like Hollywood, when people stop seeing you as valuable, they stop seeing you altogether. Financial trouble and failed marriages. By the time the love triangle headlines started to fade, Barbara Payton's film career was already in free fall. The studios had moved on to safer bets. Casting her meant explaining to investors, dealing with press questions, and risking production delays. She had burned through goodwill and there wasn't much left. Without consistent work, the money started running out fast. She had once earned $1,000 a week, a solid paycheck for someone rising through the ranks, but without new roles, she had nothing steady to rely on. There were still occasional photo gigs, bit appearances, and some low-paying work, but nothing that could cover her lifestyle or mounting bills. Barbara had built a life around fame and glamour. That kind of life was expensive. She started selling off personal items to get by. Dresses, jewelry, and furniture slowly disappeared. The lavish apartment was gone. The private parties were no more. Even everyday expenses became a struggle. She leaned on old contacts, asked for favors, and borrowed when she could. But eventually, people stopped picking up the phone. Her name, once printed on movie posters, now triggered uncomfortable silences in conversations. Then came the $12 check. It was supposed to be a small purchase at a liquor store, barely enough to matter, but the check bounced. The store owner reported it. Barbara was arrested. The charge wasn't huge. In a different context, it might have gone unnoticed, but this wasn't just anyone. It was a former film star being booked for fraud over $12. The tabloids loved it. Her mugshot was printed in newspapers across the country. Headlines called her a fallen star. They didn't focus on the amount, they focused on the spectacle. Barbara told reporters it was all a misunderstanding. She claimed she hadn't meant to deceive anyone. But that didn't matter. The story was already out there. The damage was done. The idea that a woman who used to star in films was now writing bad checks for alcohol stuck in the public mind. It made her into a punchline. She knew she needed to recover. The problem was, she didn't have the tools. Hollywood was done giving her second chances. Her name meant risk, and risk didn't sell movie tickets. She tried to find another way back in. For Barbara, that meant leaning into what she knew, relationships. In 1955, she married George Tony Provus. He wasn't a well-known figure in the film industry, which made the match seem like a possible reset. Provus offered a quieter life away from the chaos of press junkets, public scrutiny, and messy Hollywood entanglements. For a moment, it looked like Barbara might have found something close to normal. She lived in a modest home and tried to keep a low profile. She occasionally appeared in public, but was no longer making headlines the way she had in the early 1950s. There were no new film offers, no major red carpets, and no studio-driven press to keep her name in circulation. That alone made the marriage feel like a step towards something different. But Barbara wasn't built for quiet domesticity. The stillness didn't feel like peace. It felt like being forgotten. She and Provus began to argue. The fights were not private for long. Friends overheard them. Neighbors whispered, and soon the press caught on again. By 1958, the marriage ended in divorce. Another relationship collapsed, and her public image took another hit. In 1962, Barbara tried again. This time she married Jess Raleigh, a furniture salesman from outside the film world. He wasn't famous. He wasn't connected to any studios or industry people. That made him seem like a safer choice. They settled into a modest life. For a while, there were fewer public incidents. She wasn't acting anymore, and she wasn't giving interviews. Her name didn't appear in the trades or in casting rosters. Hollywood had stopped calling, and she had stopped expecting it to. Jess seemed to offer stability, but Barbara still carried the weight of her past. The reputation she built in her 20s followed her into her 30s. It didn't matter that years had passed. To most people, she was still the woman at the center of a public love triangle that ended with hospital visits and broken contracts. The marriage to Jess didn't last. They separated after a few years. The reasons were never made fully public, but those close to her said the same things that ended her previous marriages ended this one too. Arguing, drinking, and a restless nature that couldn't sit still in one place for too long. Jess faded from the picture, and unlike her earlier exes, he didn't make headlines. By that time, Barbara had burned almost every bridge she had in the industry. The film community treated her like a liability. She was seen as too unpredictable to insure, too controversial to market, and too unstable to trust on a set. She had no agent, no manager, and no advocate. She was no longer an actress looking for her next part. She was someone the business had quietly decided to leave behind. With every door in the industry closed, Barbara looked for a different way to stay visible. She still had her story, and for the first time, she decided to tell it herself. Memoir, Release, and Ongoing Struggles. In 1963, Barbara Payton released a memoir titled, I Am Not Ashamed. The title alone was a statement. She wanted people to hear her version of what happened. The book walked through her life step by step, from her early days chasing stardom to the scandal that shut her out of the business. Nothing was held back. She wrote about the relationships that derailed her image, the decisions she made, and the things she lost along the way. The way she told it, she wasn't trying to blame anyone else. She owned her actions, even the reckless ones, and she didn't try to sugarcoat what they cost her. The writing had a rawness that made it feel different from other celebrity books. It didn't sound like a studio press release or a ghost-written PR piece. It sounded like Barbara, angry, frustrated, tired, and brutally honest. She talked about money, attention, and fame, but more importantly, about how quickly all of that disappeared when the industry decided she was too risky. She didn't pretend to be misunderstood. She admitted to making bad choices and sticking with people who pulled her deeper into trouble. But she also wanted people to understand that once the media turned on her, there was no getting her reputation back. Readers didn't know what to make of the book at first. It sold, but not because people believed it was some great work of literature. It sold because people were curious. This was the same woman who once stood next to A-list stars and now couldn't get a job in a local play. People were fascinated by her fall, and she knew it. She used that interest to get the book published, but the result wasn't a redemption arc. It didn't spark a second chance in Hollywood. If anything, it confirmed what many already thought about her, that her time had passed and that her life had spiraled into something messy and chaotic. The book earned reactions that were cold, amused, or dismissive. If anything, the memoir just added more detail to the gossip people had read for years. Financially, the book didn't change her situation. Whatever advance she received didn't stretch far. She didn't land a book tour or a publishing deal for a second volume. There was no film adaptation or studio deal to dramatize her life. Once the book came out and people read it, the attention faded again. It became another quiet chapter in a long list of public disappointments. She had put her story on the table, but the public had already moved on. The emotional cost of writing the book also lingered. She revisited events that had shaped her life, many of them painful and humiliating. It forced her to relive moments that the public had treated like entertainment. Behind every name drop and headline was something personal that she had tried to carry for years. Now it was out in the open, but instead of feeling lighter, she seemed more exhausted. She had offered her truth, but it didn't come with relief. It only reminded her of what had been lost. Shortly after the book was released, her condition worsened. Her energy dropped. She stopped making public appearances. She avoided interviews. She didn't pursue any new career moves. Whatever hope she might have had that the memoir would lead to a return of any kind quickly faded. She stayed out of the spotlight, not because she wanted to, but because there was nowhere left to stand. The book had been her last major attempt to reconnect with the public. When that didn't work, she let the rest go quiet. Health collapse and last arrest. By the early 1960s, Barbara Payton's world had shrunk. In April 1962, she got into an argument with a man named John Bobby Payton. He wasn't related to her ex-husband, but he was someone she had been seeing. The argument turned physical. He pulled a knife and stabbed her during the fight. The wound was serious. The blade came close to puncturing her heart. She lost a lot of blood and collapsed in the room before anyone even called for help. She was rushed into surgery and barely made it out alive. When the police arrived and started asking questions, Barbara surprised them. She told them she didn't want him charged. She said she had provoked the fight and didn't blame him. It wasn't the first time she had taken responsibility for something that wasn't entirely hers to carry. The officers didn't push it. No charges were filed. The man walked free, and Barbara went right back into the shadows. Her health never fully recovered after that. She'd already been dealing with constant exhaustion, but now her body was showing real signs of breakdown. Her skin looked gray and dull. Her blonde hair started falling out in clumps. Her teeth were stained and brittle. She couldn't keep weight on. Her bones showed through her clothes. People who used to recognize her didn't anymore. Not because she was hiding, but because she looked like someone else entirely. The drinking had gone from casual to constant. She couldn't get through the day without it. There were pills, too, often taken with no idea what they were or what they'd mix with. Some days she didn't eat at all. On other days it was just crackers or canned soup. The Barbara Payton that once posed for photographers with a flawless smile was gone. The woman now drifting through Sunset Boulevard had no driver, no press agent, and no script. She didn't make headlines anymore, and by 1967 she was barely surviving. She still spent most nights around Los Angeles bars, places that didn't ask too many questions. She'd sit for hours nursing drinks, talking to whoever was nearby, repeating stories from the past to anyone who'd listen. Most people didn't, and when they did, they didn't believe her. That same year, she got into a fight at one of those bars. No one remembers what started it. Some say she yelled at someone who made a comment. Others say she threw a drink. By the time the police got there, she was being held back, angry and disoriented. She had scratches on her face and blood on her hands. The bartender recognized her and told the officers her name. They arrested her for disturbing the peace. It wasn't the first time. Her photo wasn't in the papers this time. No headlines, no shocked reactions, no studio statements. Just another arrest in a long list. She was processed, held, and eventually released. There was no fine she could afford to pay. She had no address to list, no consistent place to return to. The court didn't follow up. The city had bigger problems. That arrest was the last known public record tied to her name. No one made a fuss about it. There were no follow-up stories. The tabloids didn't even bother writing a sentence. She walked out of the station with no cameras waiting for her. She disappeared again, just like she had many times before. By then, the people who once cared about her career had long since erased her from their minds. Producers, agents, co-stars, they all had new names to promote and protect. Barbara had burned through every connection. Not with one scandal, but with years of instability. It didn't happen overnight. It happened slowly, day by day, until even the industry that once adored her didn't remember her face. She had no job, no home, and no way to start over. Her health was getting worse and her body wasn't healing anymore. Each night was a gamble, another chance to get hurt, picked up, or forgotten. She didn't trust anyone, but she didn't want to be alone either. And at that point, she had run out of places to go. So she returned to the only place left. Her parents were still in San Diego, and though she hadn't lived with them in years, they opened the door when she showed up. She had nothing with her, no suitcase, no money, just herself, worn down and quiet. That move back home marked the end of her time in Los Angeles. Final days and quiet death. Barbara Payton spent the last year of her life in San Diego, far from the sound stages and studios that had once welcomed her. She moved back in with her parents, Mabel and Lee, returning to the same modest home she had once outgrown. By that point, she had no steady work, no partner, and no real support system beyond her aging parents. She had lived fast, and now her days had slowed to a crawl. She stayed mostly indoors, sleeping odd hours, and leaving the house only when necessary. There were no visitors, no fans came looking for her. Her name hadn't been printed in the gossip columns for a while, and no one was calling about screen tests or modeling jobs. Her health had been on a downward slope for years, but now her body had given up trying to keep up. She was in her late 30s, but her physical condition reflected someone far older. Years of damage had caught up to her, and it was visible in her weight, her posture, her skin, and her voice. She had no energy for long conversations. She was often seen sitting by the window, smoking in silence. Sometimes she would mutter to herself, staring at the floor. Mabel did her best to care for her daughter, but there was only so much a parent could do. Barbara refused to see doctors. She didn't ask for help. She kept to herself and followed the same routine each day: sleep, drink, sit, and repeat. On May 8, 1967, around 2:30 in the afternoon, Barbara collapsed inside the bathroom of her parents' home. Mabel found her unresponsive on the floor. There were no signs of struggle, no calls for help, no warning. By the time the paramedics arrived, there was nothing more they could do. Barbara Payton was declared dead at the scene. She was 39 years old, though some records listed her as 38. No autopsy was ordered. The official report listed heart and liver failure brought on by long-term deterioration. The family didn't argue. They knew what had caused it. Even if it didn't show up in headlines, news of her death didn't make national waves. Most newspapers that reported on it kept the article brief and buried in the back pages. There were no long tributes, no commemorative TV segments, and no statements from stars she had once known. Even the men who had played major roles in her downfall were silent. Franchot Tone didn't comment. Tom Neal was already in prison for killing his wife. James Cagney, who had once worked with her, never acknowledged her publicly. Her death came and went without recognition from the same industry that once helped shape her image. For a woman whose name had filled columns with headlines, her passing barely earned a footnote. The funeral was held on May 12th at St. Andrew's Lutheran Church. A few relatives and old friends attended. Most of the people who had once circled her life were long gone. The service was simple. There was no press coverage, no crowds, no cameras. Her parents sat in the front pew, quiet and tired. The chapel was still, and when the service ended, it ended without a sound. She was laid to rest at Cypress View Mausoleum in Plot 112. The family couldn't afford a headstone. For a while, her grave remained unmarked. No visitors came, no fans left flowers. No one made a pilgrimage to remember her. The spot stayed empty and anonymous, just another square in a quiet cemetery. Eventually, a modest nameplate was added, but it didn't attract much attention. The Hollywood crowd that once tracked her every move had moved on to newer names and bigger headlines. Barbara Payton, who once posed for movie posters and magazine covers, was buried quietly, with nothing left but the fading memories of those who knew her before everything fell apart. So, what are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments down below.